And for more on those key takeaways from the ASEAN meeting in Manila this week, let's speak with Andreka Natalagawa. He's Associate Fellow at the Southeast Asia Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Andreka, thank you so much for joining us from DC. So we know ASEAN has a reputation for being heavy on consensus and light on follow-through. So does anything from this week, and it's, by all accounts, been a very busy week, show the grouping has shed at least some of that reputation, or does the lack of a code of conduct and Myanmar rejecting the 5-point consensus show that, this all talk label is still there?
Right. So when I look at this week's summit and the meetings around it, what I see sort of are two parallel stories. Right. There's the story about ASEAN and the institution and the challenges that it faces as it relates to, as you noted, the South China Sea, the crisis in Myanmar. But parallel to that trend as well is the number of different bilateral meetings that were held on the sidelines of the summit. And so what I see here is a show of ASEAN's convening power, bringing together the United States, China, other regional powers to one single meeting across the board. And so when it comes to issues specifically related to the South China Sea and Myanmar, there certainly is a lot of room to grow in terms of ASEAN's approach here. And we've seen been frustrated by sort of a lack of progress across both fronts. Having said that, I think Foreign Secretary Lazaro has pointed to future directions, at least as it relates to the crisis in Myanmar. I think floating the notion of establishing a special envoy position that could cut across chairmanship layers, I think is worth investigating. The question will just be sort of what that follow-through looks like in the weeks and months to come.
Okay, so I want to pick up on that and ask you about the specifics of the Code of Conduct. Manila and Beijing, we know, trading formal protests, with Wang Yi calling relations at a crossroad, yet both are saying at the same time they are committed to an agreement by year's end. Do you think we'll get there?
Right. So when the Philippines entered its chairmanship year for 2026, I think the expectation was that it would make the South China Sea a central focus of its ASEAN chairmanship. However, these code of conduct negotiations have gone on for decades now and have been quite thorny. And in some ways, this week, there's sort of an interesting side-by-side between the negotiations and the continuous meetings that we see on the ASEAN front, but what we're seeing on the ground in the South China Sea, given the clashes in Scarborough Shoal and Second Thomas Shoal that happened earlier this week. And so, to my eyes, as I look to the political realities of what we're seeing in the waters of the South China Sea, in some ways it feels as though negotiations and a conclusion to the Code of Conduct negotiations seem quite difficult and seem quite challenging ahead. There's still time left in the year, and policymakers in Manila are intent on making progress on this issue. But again, it is a challenging one, to be sure.
And Andreka, an external crisis, one in the Middle East, it's unexpectedly pushed energy security to the top of ASEAN's agenda. Is this the moment then ASEAN can finally move from just talking about resilience to actually delivering concrete projects like the ASEAN power grid?
Right. So the war in Iran has been a major focus of ASEAN this year in light of the energy crisis that resulted from the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And we see this in some of the statements from this week's summit in terms of the foreign minister's statement on the events in the Middle East, et cetera. The challenge here will just be how to coordinate a sort of coordinated response among the ASEAN member states. And we've already seen some movement in terms of broadening relations with Russia. There were the ASEAN-Russia summit in the past few weeks that saw some developments as it related to energy security. I expect to see similar sort of movements with a whole range of partners as ASEAN member states seek to diversify their energy relationships and seek to shore up resilience. And that's sort of the name of the game at this point in time.
So there's energy security and there's security. China's been a constant presence at this meeting, one way or another. Marco Rubio assuring allies, saying we're already present and we're not going to abandon our allies, calling the Second Thomas Shoal clash disturbing as well. So my question is this going to be credible to countries like the Philippines? Because we know the U.S. is working to improve ties right now with Beijing and also lay the groundwork for Xi Jinping's visit in September.
That's right. So in some ways, Secretary Rubio's visit to Manila for the meetings was a litmus test, right, of U.S. commitment and U.S. assurances to the region. If I'm the Philippines, if I'm a policy maker in Manila, I'd probably walk away from this feeling quite satisfied. If you look at the statements that the State Department here in Washington has put out regarding the ASEAN meetings, you'll see a whole host of priorities that the United States has enacted upon during these meetings. And in almost every single priority point, there is at least one bullet related to the Philippines. And it's clear to me, at least, that that's where sort of the energy of the United States approach to the region is in terms of shoring up the U.S.-Philippines alliance. There are developments sort of on the U.S.-ASEAN level and on bilateral relationships with other countries in the region, to be sure. But the U.S.-Philippines alliance specifically seems to be where there's the most development as it relates to Secretary Rubio's most eastern tip.
Hey, Andrika, also significant is the fact that it's the 50th anniversary of the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. So 50 years on, where do you think the TAC still has real value, and where has it struggled to keep pace with today's security environment?
Right. Well, it's no secret that the security environment that we see in Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific more broadly is challenging in a way that I think it's been some time since we've seen. Right. So the importance of the TAC, I think, is ever more highlighted given the heightened tensions that we're seeing in the course of the South China Sea, in the course of the East China Sea, and elsewhere. What I think is critical here as we think about the TAC and sort of the 50 years, and it ties back into the constant conversations that we're seeing about ASEAN as an institution and its continued relevance to Southeast Asian security and economics. We see surveys put out by organizations like the ICS Institute in Singapore that show that across Southeast Asia, elites, policymakers, business officials, and nonprofit organizations express some sort of skepticism in terms of what ASEAN centrality looks like moving forward, where the role of ASEAN sits and what role it can play in the context of U.S.-China competition. So this is in some ways an inflection point for the organization and for its institutions, including TAC.
Andrika, speaking of peace and harmony, Marco Rubio speaking to Sergei Lavrov, they met, but for only 35 minutes. Rubio calling, for fresh ideas to end the war in Ukraine. Lavrov restating Moscow's, core demands. I'm not sure whether this is in your wheelhouse, but how far do you think Ukraine has moved down on the U.S. priority list?
Right. So, one of the key sort of developments late last year in terms of the Trump administration's outlook on foreign policy was the release of key strategy documents, the National Defense Strategy, National Security Strategy. And in some ways, those laid out a very helpful framework for how the administration is thinking about its foreign policy. And to me, to my read, the priorities were the Middle East, Western Hemisphere, and broadly speaking, parts of the Indo-Pacific. In terms of where Russia and sort of the war in Ukraine sort of falls upon that nexus, we're still trying to figure out. And ultimately, when you see the sort of messaging that Secretary Rubio has been putting out for the past year, has been fairly consistent in terms of his meetings with Lavrov and calling for an end to the war. But as you noted, we haven't seen much in terms of details on that meeting itself, although then this was quite brief. But I imagine that Secretary Rubio and Secretary Lavrov, Minister Lavrov, discuss many of the same issues that they've been discussing for the past year.
All right, Andrika, we have to leave it there. Appreciate you talking to us on the show this morning. Andrika Natalagawa is Associate Fellow at the Southeast Asia Program at the CSIS.